effectively what we're talking about here is that the actions of the Fed, particularly in modern American history, it's the old Martin Luther King quote of like socialism for the wealthy, the corporations, the financial institutions, and rugged individualism for the poor. And then you have this whole issue of moral hazard, which is this idea that like, well, now you just incentivized these people to keep taking more risk and then keep taking more bailouts. If there's no punishment for making terrible decisions, bankrupting their own respective companies, crashing the global economy, you let them know, hey, times are going to be better than ever because we're going to give you free money after that anyway. There's moral hazard. You've now incentivized that action further. So my question is, let's go all the way back to 2008, and we just had the crash. What needs to be done? Is it do the same kind of bailouts, but like have Congress in tandem have very strict rules along with it? So like, okay, we're going to bail you out, but you can't pay out any bonuses. You can't do any stock buybacks. X amount has to go to your workers, so on and so forth. Is that the idea? Is the idea just, hey, no bailouts? Is like the right-wing libertarian idea correct? It's just, hey, no bailouts. If you failed, you failed. Or is it something like the Fed does quantitative easing for the working class? Can the Fed even do quantitative easing for the working class? So answer some of those questions.
Yeah, you bet. And, you know, one thing I would like to get to is the decade of the 2010s, which led to one of the largest bailouts in history, which is ongoing today. And it's been really obscured by the chaos of COVID and the Trumpism and the insurgency and all the rest of it. I'm sorry, the insurrection and all the rest of it. But to go back to what you're talking about, the crash of 0809, you know, what should we have done? What was the alternative to quantitative easing? You know, we have a very instructive previous event in history, which was the banking crash of 1929 and 1930, which was in many ways identical to the crash of 0809. When you will look at the history, these asset prices were built up. You had the same kind of wild speculation on Wall Street, stock market crash, all the rest of it. The administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Congress reacted to the banking crash of 1929 in a way that put, and I'm sorry to like use this term, which is cliche now, but they put structural reform at the beginning of the agenda. The first thing FDR did when he came into office was to shut down the banks. He called it a bank holiday, but the banks were shut down. And then the federal government created something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I might be getting that name a little bit wrong. The correct name is in the book, but there's RFC. They took over banks that had made wild, reckless, speculative loans. They essentially nationalized and broke up those banks. And then they put in structural reforms to break apart the banking system. We all know about the Glass-Steagall Act, which it was like a commandment from the Bible in the sense that it was very simple, very short, and very sweeping in its effect. Glass-Steagall said, okay, we're going to have speculative investment banks over here, and then we're going to have commercial banks that hold people's savings accounts over here, and never the twain shall meet, okay? They're going to be separate. The New Deal era, which really lasted about 6 or 7 years of legislation, it did something critically important. It changed the structure of the Wall Street banking system, and it put a leash on Wall Street. It created the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and it broke up the big banks. The administration of Barack Obama and his Treasury Secretary, Timothy Geithner, who was a former president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, which is really the key hub bank of the 12 regional banks, they came at it with an entirely different philosophy. And their philosophy was no structural change. No. Because the theory they stated was that there was already so much chaos. There was sort of this fear to get in and start kind of tampering with the engine, if you will, in the midst of a time when stock markets were crashing, unemployment was rising. And they said, we're going to have this theory of simply recapitalizing the banks that exist, okay? We're not going to break them up. Glass-Steagall is a relic of an older time. and we're going to simply pump money into the system. And the results of that are crystal clear. The too big to fail banks in 2008 are now bigger and less able to fail. And it's so interesting, the sort of compromises they made. They sort of tried to create a synthetic pretend Glass-Steagall in these things that we call the stress tests and the so-called living wills of the banks. They're like, okay, banks, we're not going to break you up, but you need to prove to us that if we hit a massive downturn again, that you can handle it without, needing a bailout. And so the banks, dutifully prepare these reports that are hundreds of pages long and speculate how the banks will survive in case of a downturn. It turns into a huge fight that lasts for years between lawyers as to the numbers. And look, the reality is we avoided doing everything but making fundamental structural change to the banking system.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said. All right, so let's get up to the 2010s.
Yeah.
What does the Fed learn from its many rounds of quantitative easing, and what do they do going forward, and in particular in response to the pandemic?
So, first of all, the debates